All right. Today we're going to talk about prevention of eating disorders. And so I actually just read this book that was recommended to me by so many dietitians. It's called How to Raise an Intuitive Eater. And it goes against a lot of my medical doctor training, but not so much my training in psychology and mental health. It kind of fits more in. The two can be a little bit conflicting at times, but I've been able to tease apart most of what it is, at least what I want to do when I raise my kids, and a goal for them to be healthy, but also not have eating disorders. But before I start going through my thoughts about that book, you each found an article relating to the prevention of eating disorders. So one that was submitted was entitled Preventing Eating Disorders and Disordered Eating in Genetically Vulnerable High-Risk Families. So who was the one that submitted that? And if nobody says anything else, assume that whoever submitted it isn't present for today's session. All right, so whoever submitted it but isn't here. All right, so this was, let's see, published in the Journal of Eating Disorders, which, it's kind of makes a lot of sense here. And so let's see, specifically, yeah, it's overdue for development, I'll tell you that. And parent-based prevention, which, yeah, it's a lot of the times by the time people come to see me, I don't want to sound like a naysayer, but it's kind of too late. And that's why I'm really big into teaching parents and society what to do to help develop mentally resilient and healthier people. For example, we did the sexual assault awareness. Were any of you in attendance to that? So this was about 2 years ago, and it was really focusing on, although the target audience I wanted to be there was the perpetrators, but they're not going to show up, because I like to focus on what we can do as parents and a society to prevent, like I explained during it, I'm going to say men, but I suppose women can be the perpetrators of sexual assault too, but just for clarity's sake, I'll say men, to raise boys to not engage in these harassing behaviors and to be respectful of women. And so that's more of like I don't want to focus so much on the victim comes to me and then I'm like, oh, these are the things you should do differently. It's like, well, how can we as a society raise men or boys to not sexually assault people in the first place, rather than teaching women like, don't wear skirts and go out late at night. So this is more of by the time people come to see me, they've unfortunately already been assaulted or unfortunately already have an eating disorder. And I think it makes way more sense to focus in on the prevention of these things. But unfortunately, usually the people that I need to reach are the people that aren't interested in watching and learning things. But for those individuals out there that want to do all they can to prevent eating disorders, this would be a good place to start. So this specific research paper focused on intervention for families, because that's like when you're growing up, that's who you're spending the most time with. So because the person who submitted that article isn't here, we'll go to the next article, which is Lockdown with My Eating Disorder, a retrospective study on the impact of COVID-19 and adolescents with eating disorders. That's pretty interesting. Who had this one?
That was me.
All right. Tell us what you gleaned from this that could be helpful for audience members and society alike in the prevention of eating disorders.
Okay, so the big gist of that study was that since they were assessing how COVID-19 impacted eating disorders, the big takeaway was that COVID-19 actually did end up helping most people with eating disorders, and that's because primarily like they were in isolation, so they didn't have to worry as much about their body image. And so that's something interesting.
Absolutely. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today has to do with people interacting with other people and body image and diet culture. So if people are inside chilling and they're not going out and being judged and that sort of thing by other people, I suppose that could indeed be a protective factor. So that's interesting. Any
But
other points from your article
yeah,
that
there
you?
was one other point. I think actually when it came to anorexia, I believe, um, more people who didn't already possess symptoms of anorexia developed them. And I think in the study they mentioned that it was partially because of social media, which does.
Yes. So I was going to say social media is a really big negative when it comes to prevention of eating disorders. It kind of makes eating disorders worse, especially since not only back in my day we were all photoshopping and everything was Photoshop, but now everything's AI generated, so it's even worse with expectations to live up to. All right, any other tidbits of information from lockdown with eating disorder?
That was pretty much it. And I think they kind of just conveyed a lot of the basic information, like eating disorders are most prevalent among adolescents these days and things like
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very prevalent, especially in late teens, early 20s.
that. Yeah.
But they're develop. I mean, they can develop way early, even when you're a little kid. And then there was a third study that was turned in. Was that for anybody else here turn in a study?
I turned in a study.
Yeah, was that interventions for preventing eating
Yeah,
disorders in children and
yeah,
adults?
it was.
All right. Well, tell me about that one.
So my article was mostly about the like preventative measures taken for people with like anorexia or like bulimia. And it talked about like promoting healthy eating attitudes and behaviors, as well as like psychological factors, which can promote physical health and having like long-term sustainable impact on mental and physical health. So yeah.
Yeah, it said that there were 5 things: promoting healthy eating, promoting protective psychological factors, promoting satisfactory physical health, having long-term sustainable positive impact on mental and physical health, ensuring safety in relation to possible harmful consequences. All right. Okay. Did anybody else do any research that they want to discuss before we dive in any further? All right. So I'm assuming none of you have kids. And right? I don't know. You guys, it's hard to be pre-med and have kids, so that's just my assumption. Now, before I had kids, my thinking was I'm gonna cook what I cook, and my kids either gonna eat it or not eat it, and that's too bad. And I'm in control of what they eat. And I always just thought, what's all this complaints about kids and eating? Like, I make dinner and they eat it, or if they don't want it, then too bad they don't eat it. Yeah, it doesn't work like that at all. In fact, it's it's a huge struggle. Um, you really when you have little kids, it's especially with the picky eating, which you'll see whenever I go over some of the things I highlighted. You should not label your child in any such way, especially out loud, because they will cling on to it. But so in as a medical doctor, and I often tell my patients in the clinic, when they come in to improve life, I explain, like, as a medical doctor, I have to weigh you because, well, some dosages of medications, I need to know the weight. And also some medications cause weight gain, some cause weight loss, and I need to monitor what's going on. And some things like stimulants, I can't prescribe if somebody has a BMI under 19. So from a medical standpoint, I do need to know people's weight. But from a mental health standpoint, I hate taking it, and you'll see why in a little bit. But they really, in the medical field, place a lot of emphasis on BMI. And when I worked for the Coast Guard, we had to do some disqualifications based on BMI. Even if the person, you look at them, there's a lot of people you look at and you wouldn't think that they qualify as overweight or obese or what have you, but then you calculate their BMI and it does fall into that category. And a lot of times it just seems like it doesn't make sense, and a lot of times it doesn't. And when you have kids and you're bringing them to the pediatrician, they always have you on these growth charts and weight charts, and the pediatrician will opine extensively if you're falling in the top or in the bottom. So for my children, they're both underweight. And so every time we go, it's always the discussion about like eating more. And as you'll see, that's not necessarily a good thing, because the more you try to control what and how your child eats, the more that they're going to fight back. And that actually is one of the things that can lead to eating disorders. So physicians going on and on about like your kid needs to lose weight, they're in too high of the area, or your kid needs to gain weight, they're too low. That hearing that over and over again can actually predispose kids to eating disorders. And so it's kind of like, oh, well, the health professional is doing something that is actually negative for eating disorders. So, but at the same time, they can't just ignore it if it's serious. So it's like, how do you control it without controlling it? It's very, very difficult. So for my kids, when they're both underweight, and so it's constantly like, you need to eat more, or and me personally, as a parent, I want my kids to eat healthy. And as you'll see after having read this book, I'm gonna have to change my obsession with my kids eating so healthy, because when I keep doing that, it's going to create some sort of issues. But so I personally, this is another thing the book talks about, is like restricting sorts of food. There's no like candy or junk food in my house. Now, having read this book, I'm not sure if I'm 100% convinced that I'm going to do this. But it says to have foods of all kinds available to your kids. And I don't, and a lot of it is reflecting on what you as a parent value. And so I'm just like super healthy, like super into like eating right and lots of exercise, which is kind of, it's okay, but it's kind of goes into what's called diet culture, which this book gets into, is kind of how our society idolizes thinness and quote unquote being like physically fit with being thin, and equating like being overweight with being unhealthy, which isn't the big deal that it sort of is. So in the book, it explains, so a bell curve, if you have your two ones that are the standard deviations all the way over to the right and to the left, the people that are actually the most likely at health risks are the people at the very, very, very morbidly obese category, and the people who are in the very underweight category, where then that's the reality of it. But whenever they talk about like the correlation between being unhealthy and weight, you think like for every 5 pounds you gain, the more unhealthy you are. And so it sort of just continues this idea that being 10 pounds overweight, you're like 10% more unhealthy, and being 20 pounds overweight, you're like 20% more unhealthy. But that's not exactly how it works in real life. And so the diet culture that our society like wraps everybody up in isn't exactly reflective. So in general, when you become overweight, of course, you're going to be more predisposed to like cardiovascular issues and things like that. So the medical doctor in me just, I just can't go out and just buy tons of junk food and put it in my house. I mean, the book has some good points, but I just don't see myself like going and doing that. But there is a lot that I think personally for me was good advice. Like, well, we'll see. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the external control. So, how I was saying that the pediatrician, like, they'll tell my kids like, oh, you need to eat more things with like fats, like higher calorie things, like put oil, just give them like a whole spoonful of oil and avocado. And the more you tell a kid to do something, the more they're not going to want to do it. And so if my goal is to get my kids to eat more, and then at the same time, from my own personal beliefs, so the pediatrician wants my kids to eat more. And then from my background training as a physician and my personal beliefs, I want them to eat healthy, because I'm really big into like gut biome, and I digress, but there was some research I did into fecal transplants and how like the actual what you eat and what's chilling in your intestines and in your GI tract actually make you crave more of those foods, that sort of thing. So from that standpoint and that background of mine, I really want my kids to eat healthy. So I have the pediatrician saying more, and I have me saying eat healthy, but I have this intuitive eating um, eating disorder prevention mentality that is more of a let your kids do and eat what they want, because they are their own being and they have like an innate ability to determine what it is they're hungry for, how much they can fit, and at what times they want to eat. So I have these like three sort of conflicting ideas about how to feed my child, and so it's going to be different for every parent. But what I really want to focus in on today is not so much medical aspects, or like if your kid is morbidly obese, like how to get them to lose weight. And you should never ever tell your kid you're putting them on a diet, because the focus of today is the prevention of eating disorders. So one thing is, the more you try to control your kid, the more they're going to fight back. So if the pediatrician is saying that my son needs to eat lots of avocados with lots of oil, and we're harping on that, and I'm telling him that, he's going to be like, no, because he's a toddler and they love to say no. So that's just not going to go. All right. And so we're talking about the pediatricians always concerned with the growth curve. And you guys, whenever you have kids or whenever you do your pediatrics rotation, you're going to see it's all about the growth charts, like an obsession. It's just like heavens. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier, my daughter's picky, which is something that happens whenever they turn like preschool age. When she was a toddler, she ate pretty much anything. But what I knew better, and I did this anyway. Speaking of knowing better and doing this anyway, we got to make a big emphasis, and I'm going to go like this. There is no perfect parent, okay? Everybody say that with me now. There's
No perfect.
There is no perfect
parent.
Yes. Okay, good. And you guys, I'm recording this, so we'll come back for when you are parents or when you're on your peds rotation. It's because a lot of times parents feel that their children's behavior is a reflection on their ability to be a parent, and that's like just not true at all. Of course, a lot of it is just genetics. I mean, if you have a kid and their behavior is just atrocious, maybe it's because you're a bad parent, or maybe it's because of genetics, or maybe it was from an external factor that you had absolutely nothing to do with, but you can, like, let's just say child A, their behavior is like 25% genetics and like 75% their environment around them. That means the max, even if you're perfect, you can only be 75% perfect. So I just want to reiterate that your child's behavior is not a reflection of your value as a parent. Okay. And I think that every parent needs to realize this, because also, like, for me, like, this is what I do for a living. I tell people how to do and interact and have consistency with raising their kids, so that their kids don't grow up to have all these mental health issues. And so whenever my kids are out at the grocery store running around and acting crazy, I'm like, oh, that makes me look bad. But then I have to tell myself what I tell everybody is, your child's behavior is not a reflection of how you are as a parent. Of course, there's like, some things you could do that really mess them up. I mean, there's abusive parents and neglectful parents, like, yeah. But sometimes you could do absolutely everything perfectly, but then there's this like genetic factor, and that your kid's behavior is out of this world. So let's just realize that there is no perfect parent. So getting back to my mistake, now that I gave myself a pep talk, it was basically, I knew not to label my child, because they're like sponges and they pick up on absolutely everything that everybody around them says and does, especially their parents. And so I said out loud that my daughter was a picky eater. And then I was like, oh no. And so the next time, like, we sat down to eat and somebody was like, oh, do you want some of this? She said, no, I'm a picky eater. And I'm like, oh, I did this. So when you start labeling your child as, the example that's given in the book is just something like, I guess we'll take mangoes. Like you give your kid mango one day and they're like, ugh, I don't like it. And then 2 weeks later, you go to a picnic and somebody's like, have a mango. And you say, oh, Sally doesn't like mangoes. And then Sally's going to be like, she's thinking, oh, I was going to try it. But if I don't like mangoes, then I guess I don't want to try it. Like you're basically telling your kid. So it's funny because like if you try too hard to get your kid to eat something, it's almost like you have to use reverse psychology. So number one, you don't want to label your kid as a picky eater or say, oh, Tommy doesn't like apples, or say these things, because your kid will be like, oh, well, if I don't like apples, then I won't even try them. Okay. So my child is a picky eater, but don't let her hear me say that. All right. So we talked about the pediatrician picky phase. Oh man, it's really tough, especially because kids change their minds so rapidly. And I'm talking specifically here about little kids. My daughter will say something like, I want macaroni and cheese for dinner, and then we'll boil the macaroni and then make the cheese sauce and do it all. It'll take, 30 minutes, and we sit down and I give her the mac and cheese that she wanted, and she'll be like, I don't want this. And it's just like, oh my goodness. It's like, heavens, what are we going to do? So, but you can't get mad at your kid. A lot of people will be like I said, I thought earlier, like you either eat this or you don't eat this, and it just doesn't work like that. Because in my case, if my kids don't eat, then they don't eat, and then I go back to the pediatrician and they're like, oh, they're low on the height and weight. So it's a very delicate balance. All right, so let's talk about, all right, so intuitive eating basically is the idea that your kid as an entity, as a living, breathing being, animal in this world, is going to be able to determine what they want and when they want and how much. And so if you always are telling your kid, oh, you're eating way too much of that, you got to slow down, you got to stop, your kid is never going to get to the point where they eat so much they get sick and learn themselves that it's too much. So I like I said, I limit the junk food, which is not, I'm going to try to not limit it so much, but I did the right thing in that when we go out to eat, if my daughter wants juice, I let her just order it. There's no juice in my house because I don't particularly want my kids drinking juice because it's just sugar, empty calories. And then when they eat that, they're not hungry for real food. But I don't want to make juice like a dirty word or anything. So when we go out, we'll order it. They don't eat ice cream either. Same thing. If we go out and they want ice cream, I'll let them have it, but we don't keep ice cream in the house. But my daughter actually learned the hard way, and she did actually learn the next time. We went out, she ordered ice cream, she ate a ton of ice cream and got sick. But the next time we went out, she ordered ice cream and she only ate half of it. And I was like, oh, you're full. And she's like, yeah, I don't want to get sick again. So if you remove the result from, sorry, speaking of kids, my kids are actually screaming. That's why I'm distracted. If you remove the result of them overeating, and then they'll never get to that point and they won't have experience in themselves. So don't jump in and be like, don't eat any more of that. You ate too much. You have to let them learn on their own. That's the intuitive eating. And then there's some good things in here that's like, it's very tricky trying to say no without actually saying no. If you say no to food, you don't want to label the food. So again, another thing I did wrong was, hey, there are no perfect parents, is that I labeled a regular pizza from like Pizza Hut or Domino's or whatever as bad pizza, because if my kids eat pizza at my house, it's usually chickpea pizza, which I erroneously referred to as good pizza. So now my kids are like, know that there's a good pizza and a bad pizza, and they always ask, can we have bad pizza? And it's just like, they mean the like high caloric, less nutritional pizza, because I went and inadvertently labeled it as such. So you don't want to be labeling food as good or bad. So if your kid wants something and it's just totally not appropriate to give them, don't say like, oh, I don't want you eating XYZ because it's bad for you and there's too much sugar. You want to say something like, okay, we don't have any of that right now, but when we do, I'll let you have a little bit of it, or something like that. You don't want to label it as being like, okay, this particular food is like evil or something. Because when your kid starts thinking of a food as being bad or being restricted, when they have the opportunity to eat it, they will go for it. So you can't watch your kids all day, every day, like at school. Like at home, if you're like, okay, Skittles are horrible, don't ever eat them. And as soon as some kid brings Skittles to school, your kid's gonna like go tackle that kid and like eat all his Skittles. So you gotta like remember that sort of thing. So and another thing is you don't want to guilt or shame your kids. So if your kids are on the side of the growth chart that's like too high, and the pediatrician's like, whoa, they shouldn't, because the American Academy of Pediatrics actually recommends dieting. So the pediatrician shouldn't, but I've heard they can say, all right, you need to put your kid on a diet. At no point should any child lose weight. If anything, they should continue growing, but then maintaining the same weight. So it's just, most governing bodies do agree that children should not be put on a diet. However, a lot of children actually see their parents and other people dieting with the diet culture. And so they think that, oh, this is what my parents are doing, or this is what the neighbors are doing, so I should be doing it too. You just don't want your kids to think about dieting. You just want your kids to think about being kids. All right, so there's an interesting definition. Orthorexia, so harmful overconcern about healthy eating. And so maybe I have this, but in my defense, I also have celiac disease, so I can't eat gluten. So basically, when I go out and like everybody's eating donuts, and hold on, my kids are running around screaming. Guys, please be quiet. Love you. The irony. No. Oh, wait, I'm going to tell them to be quiet, and then they'll rebel by being louder. Okay, so you don't want to be overly concerned about health. So I felt like I was doing a little bit of a good job about that by letting my kids have juice and ice cream when they go out and stuff. But according to this book, I should have it, around available so that they can decide if that's something that they want. But I also don't want to get to the point where that's all they eat. But it says if you have ice cream available all the time, that your kid probably won't eat it all the time. But I don't know. I don't want to test that. So there's a lot of good in this book, and it was recommended to me by like every dietitian I met. Okay, so self-regulation is the backbone of this intuitive eating. So like I said, kids should be able to know when they're hungry and what they're hungry for and how much. So like my daughter had the ice cream episode where she ate too much, and then she got sick, and then she remembered, probably shouldn't do that anymore. So an interesting fact is, well, who do you think of whenever you think of somebody with an eating disorder? Like, describe the person to me. Not everybody all at once.
Just I
Um,
was like, sorry. Go
it's
ahead.
okay. I don't know why, but like I feel like I usually associate all eating disorders with like anorexia specifically. I know that like I don't know, this is like a specific association, but a lot of the girls on my track team, they had this problem of just like associating slimness with like faster times.
Yes,
Yeah.
and there's an entire chapter in this book that states that being a student athlete puts you at greater risk for eating disorders. Now, that's not to say don't let your kid be an athlete, because that's another risk. It's, if your kid's an athlete, just be extra cautious. So yes, in general, when people think of eating disorders, they mostly do think of people who are very underweight and have anorexia. However, that's only 10% of the people with eating disorders. There are other eating disorders like bulimia, where people are typically normal weight, and then there's binge eating disorder, where people can be normal weight or overweight. And you could actually have anorexia without being underweight. It's some new term that I actually wasn't familiar with, and when I get to the page, if I do get to it, I will point it out, because I wasn't aware of that either. Oh, so usually with anorexia, there's like definable like criteria, and one of them is amenorrhea. Does anybody know what amenorrhea is? It is when you stop having your period, and that is one of the defining characteristics of anorexia. However, this book goes into, there are some types of anorexia where people can still have their periods. So the point of what I'm trying to say is that when most people think of eating disorders, they do think of an extremely thin, you can see their bones type of person, but that picture is actually only 10% of all eating disorders. And if I come to the page, I will point it out and explain to you what, but there's binge eating disorders, and there's also bulimia, and then there's the ARFID. I'm just trying to remember this out of memory, where it's like a extreme form of pickiness, and there are some where the textures bother people to the point where they actually start throwing up and those sorts of things. So just know that you can't tell if somebody has an eating disorder just by looking at them. Okay, so I'm trying to flip through to see if I can find. So let me just parenting tips out there. If you, instead of saying to your kid, like, do you want vegetables? Because they're just gonna be like, no. You'll be like, do you want bell peppers or do you want carrots? And then the kid has a choice, and then they're more likely to engage in it if they think that they picked it themselves. So these open-ended questions are, no, I don't want vegetables. But if you say, do you want this or this, then giving the child the ability to choose is really a protective factor and helps them a lot. Okay, so let's see. Establishing boundaries, like I said, and a lot of times it's like you're on your way out, and that's when the kid decides that they want to be hungry. It's like they can sense when you're going to try to put their shoes on and put them in the car. In that case, you can just explain, like, you know, I respect that you're hungry, and I'm sorry that we can't do anything right now, but we're literally like on our way out the door, instead of saying like, no, you can't eat that. All right, and then let's see, negative control. So whenever I was trying to combat the pickiness, I have to say that quiet, I don't want my kids to hear me say the word picky. Oh, and the other things I don't let my kids hear me say: fat, thin, any comments about anybody else's body, any comments about my body. If so, my own issues, like if I'm like, I ate too much today or I had too many calories, I do not say these things out loud. I do not want my kids to even have that in their minds. So I just don't use any of these words. So of course, I'm not gonna say picky, but I don't use any descriptors of body parts, like anything like that. You got to be really careful and positive about body parts, body image. Like, for example, I like purposefully, and it's a struggle too, because you don't hear that people do this very often, but complimenting your child's different body parts so that they have more of a positive body image. One that I do is, we have a trampoline, not one of the big dangerous ones, but we have a little trampoline. And whenever my daughter's jumping on it, I'm like, you have really good jumping legs. Because kids, whenever they see everything in society and all the negative stuff, they're going to start thinking like, oh, my thighs are too fat or my legs are too stubby, yada, yada, yada. But if they're like, no, my mommy says that my legs are really good for jumping. So I just, I have to, like, if my kid is playing video games, I'll be like, your fingers are really good at pressing buttons. Like, any time that you can even think of a positive thing to say about some aspect of your child's body, say it, because all they're going to hear is negative stuff from other people. So using positive and negative controls to try to control what your kid is eating. So I do have a behavior chart. All my years of psychology, I always knew that I was going to do some sort of chart for discipline, for lack of a better term, of my kids. And so I do have a sticker for trying new foods and eating vegetables, but the book does state that you shouldn't do any punishment or rewards for things. Like, you shouldn't say, oh, if you finish eating your banana, then you can have a bite of cake. Like, it just says, like, that's just not something that you're supposed to do, because you need to respect your child's ability to decide and that sort of thing. I still give stickers for trying new foods. You have to adapt these things to you, but these are just, if you want to be very protective against eating disorders, you shouldn't associate any kind of prize or punishment or anything with any kind of food, because those associations will just take off and lead to, negative ideas about food. So humans need to think this is like not mind control, but humans need to think that their decisions are originating from within themselves, the autonomy. And so, like with the, instead of asking my kids, do you want vegetables? No. It's like, do you want carrots or do you want bell peppers? And then they pick carrots and they're like, okay, that was my decision. All right, positive meal experiences. So I sit down with my kids at a table, all of us, there's no toys, there's no phones, there's no TVs on, and we all talk. And even if my kid's not eating, I'm like, you still have to sit here and talk to me. It's okay if you're not hungry. I used to say you better eat, but now I'm like, okay, it's okay if you're not hungry, just sit and have a conversation with us. And don't argue and don't be ridiculous around the table. Just, how's your day? And I even have like talking points. Like I asked like my kids, like, what's your favorite planet? And like, you know, things like that, just to get some community during the dining experience. Okay, and then just fun science fact, ghrelin is a hunger hormone that is higher during hunger and decreases after eating. That's just the section that basically explains that a lot of this is just basically pertinent to people that don't have any sort of underlying hormonal or chromosomal abnormalities, right? I'm not sitting here talking about how to raise somebody that has something like Prader-Willi's disease, where they're like uncontrollably eating so much because it is an actual biological disease that they have. This is applicable to people that don't have things like that. Of course, if your hormones are all out of whack, that's a different story. Another reason that what I'm saying is a different story is if you have food insecurity. So you're not going to have the luxury of letting your kid pick between the carrots and the bell peppers if you can only afford carrots, right? So a lot of what I'm saying is not applicable to people that have certain genetic predispositions to diseases like Prader-Willi's or something like that, or people who don't have access to food. Because you know what, I was talking about juice. If juice is the only way that they can get their calories for the day, then that's what they got to do. So a lot of this what is that would add a whole nother layer to combating eating disorders. And unfortunately, the way modern medicine and the studies are going, they're really biased against people who are genetically predisposed to be healthy, and people of socioeconomic disadvantages, and people of color. All those things, they don't study people in those categories, and the recommendations don't take those difficult situations into effect when making the recommendation. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Like, if you're watching this and your kid's hormones are out of whack and you can't afford to do these things like that, I definitely understand that that is going to put even more barriers and making it even harder to listen to the pediatrician about the growth curve, and then the health nuts and the diet industry, and then, you know, the mental health and eating disorders. It's like, there is no perfect parent, right? So you just take as much knowledge as you can and do as much with it as you can, and don't beat yourself if you're not doing it right. So don't worry about people judging you or your kid. They didn't watch this YouTube and they're not reading books, they're just being judgy. So this also goes into response, stimulus, is space. So a lot of times something happens and then you automatically respond, but you got to take a breather before you respond, especially if you have automatic reactions to, like if I make this big meal for my kid and they're like, I'm not going to eat it. And I want to be like, eat it. I'm like, take a deep breath. I'm like, okay, what do you want? You know, you gotta take a breather there. All right. And so like if your kid says something like, hey, what are all those dimples on your legs? Instead of me being like, that's cellulite and I hate it and I wish I could figure out how to get rid of it, you will just say like, that's just something that happens and I don't mind it a bit. I'm not saying lie to your kids, but I don't straight up tell my kids like, man, I wish I could get rid of my cellulite. I'll just say something like, you know what, that's just the part of mommy and we're not gonna worry about it. And you teach your kids that everybody's body is belonging to them, and it's nobody's place to comment on somebody else's body, which is hard because they watch TV and they go to movies, and you're not going to control every single thing that somebody says to your kid, but you can control what you say to your kids. So don't have negative talk about your body in front of your kids. So you want to model, like I said, kids sponge up everything. You don't want to focus too much on you or your kid's appearance. Like my daughter, I always tell her how cute she is, but then I'm like, no, I also have to say how kind, and she's pretty funny too. So you don't want to like obsess over like aspect of your child that they can't alter, because then if something changes about that, then they feel like their worth was wrapped up in it, and then if that changes, then they'll feel like they have less worth. So always make sure that you compliment like other things that they can control, like their personality or piano playing skills and things like that. All right, so be in charge without being in control. So I put out some few foods for my kids. I don't put out ice cream for them. So I'm being in charge, but then they get to pick out of the amount of foods that they give them. So then they feel like they're in control, at least of a little bit. Have your kids engage in the food preparation. When we make pancakes, we have my daughter come up on a stool so she can see and mix everything, and like get your kids interested in like the preparation of food, and even like gardening and the planting of food and things. And then when you are eating food, you should say things like, oh, this is really good, thank you so and so for making it. And you should say like, you want the kids to associate food with like positivity, instead of you sitting there being like, oh, I don't want to eat this because it's too many calories and I'm watching my thighs. Like stuff like that gets ingrained in their little sponge heads, and then those are planting the seeds for eating disorders. All right, so let me take a look. So it has some schedules. It's so hard. So they really want you to have like a schedule. So we eat breakfast and dinner at the same time every day. And when the kids are at school, they have lunch. So they want you to have schedule, but they also want you to be flexible. So if my kids are like after dinner, they want something. I've, since reading this book, expanded the snacks. They're still all kind of healthy, to be honest, but I'll give them, some like lentil puffs and stuff like that. And so if they're hungry outside of these scheduled meal times, they should still have the choice to be able to eat. And then the teen years and puberty, like kids' weight changes so much, and they're really, really hungry, and they're going to eat a lot. So you just have to prepare for that. But also, when they're teens, you aren't going to be around for a lot, if not most of their meals. So if you raise them to be not hesitant or shameful or guilty about certain foods when they're little, then hopefully it won't carry over to the teen years. All right, so let's see. Variety plate in the middle of the table. So that's something I'm gonna have to do, because what I used to do is just make what my daughter likes to eat, and then I eat something different, and then we all eat different things. But what it should be is like family style in the middle of the table, bunch of different options, and then your kid can pick what appeals to them most. You should put one or two things your kid is gonna like, and then a few new things. It says in the book that kids need to be presented with something sometimes 20 times before they decide to try it. So keep showing it to them. And I tell my daughter, like, you need to just look at it, you don't have to eat it, just kind of get used to it. So no shame. So there's also like an emotional aspect to eating, and there's a lot of eating disorders that are tied into trauma. And so sometimes people do eat to comfort themselves, and the book makes a point that it sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like if you're eating to make yourself feel better, but it does point out, in the grand scheme of things, all the things that you could do as a coping skill. That's not one of the worst ones. If your kid is doing it too much, you want to say, like, obviously find the root cause. Like, why are they having an emotional issue with somebody bullying them, that sort of thing. But just be aware that food is obviously tied into with emotions a lot, and sometimes people do it for comfort. And then food deprivation, like if you notice that your kid, if he's like is like eating in secret or throwing away their food secretly, any food behaviors in secret are a red flag that you need to look into. And And so binge eating disorder, which is BED, it says you never want the goal to be weight reduction. You don't want to put them on a diet. You want to find the underlying cause and get to the true healing. You don't want to be like, oh, well, you're binge eating, so just stop eating so much. That's not going to work. All right, so we talked about growth spurts during puberty where kids are going to eat more. So this is one thing that I actually use a lot. Like whenever I make a lot of food, the kids want, and it's a lot of time, then I give it, and then they're like, I don't want this. And then I take the breather instead of just reacting. This is one of the phrases that I highlighted in the book. It says, I'm frustrated. I'm going to take a few minutes and reset, and then we'll try again. I do that a lot. I'm like, I'm frustrated. I just need a few minutes. So it's okay to take a few minutes. All right. Let's see. Dinner. It's a good time. Okay, if you're in the car, it's like kids know when you're leaving and that's when they want to eat. It's funny. All right. So there is a lot in our society where like disordered eating is like glorified and just associated with somehow being healthier, like people who do intermittent fasting, or so there was like, you know, the Atkins, and then there's keto, and then there's Whole30. These diets only work for when you're doing them. And that's the whole thing, is that if you want to diet, it's got to be like a whole lifestyle. It's you do this diet and then you lose weight, but then when you stop the diet, it all comes back. And it's just this yo-yoing effect. And so the book explains that dieting really doesn't work well to begin with. And the parents dieting or implementing a diet on their children is just going to be, again, like signing them up for this whole yo-yoing effect for years to come. They want to do gentle nutrition. So I'll talk about nutrition recommendations. So I like to get my kids some omega-3s. So my daughter, for some strange reason, likes to eat flax seeds, which is fine. So I give this to her as a little snack. So if you want to find something, you just keep trying 20 times and then you find it, and then like it's a good go-to that's fortunately healthy. If you eat too much flax seeds, you'll be going to the bathroom a lot. So you don't, just like with anything, you don't want too much of something. And then stress, it contributes to inflammation and impacts the health. And if your kid is really stressed out, you gotta make sure you find the underlying cause. And then people have different metabolic rates. So some people, no matter how hard they try, are just going to be stuck in an overweight or obese category. And the way that our society is, and the pressure from the physicians to be in the healthy range, it's just not fair to a lot of people who their biology is just such that that's just how they are. And then they're always striving to lose weight, but in some cases, it's just not possible. So I blame society. But let's see. So like I said, the meals in the middle of the table, different things to choose from, letting the kid pick, but then also you're a little bit in charge by not throwing out all kinds of ice cream. We got to have iron, calcium, vitamin D, fiber, the omega-3, like I said. You got to have vitamin C. This is a whole different topic about vitamins and things. I give my kids Flintstone vitamins. I took them when I was a kid and I'm still here. So hopefully that's a good idea. You want to maintain a peaceful and positive association with food and meals. So keep it happy and talk about, like, what's your favorite planet? And, if they don't want to eat, don't pressure them to, but have them stick around at the table and you hang out as a family, have a good time. So this is something that I'm very happy. So when kids become accustomed to drinking water, they'll tend to hold on to that preference later on in life. So the go-to drink in my house is water, and that's good. And I noticed that I don't like juice. They do say you need to stop your hate about sugar. So kids learn at school that sugar is bad and people have a fear of sugar. And I probably just made my kids afraid of sugar too. But, you don't, again, want your kids to have a negative association with certain things and then at some point they might have access to sugar and think of this magical forbidden food and then like overeat or like sneak it or things like that. So decadent, which is when you guys hear the word decadent, what are you picturing? Chocolate cake? Come on, guys. Decadent chocolate cake?
Oh, I was confused what you meant first.
Yeah, so whenever the word decadent, I mean, whenever I think of that, I always picture like an advertisement, like with a fork, like a triple chocolate cake. But the actual definition of decadent is characterized by moral decline. So our society kind of associates these like really sweet things with like having low self-restraint or not having good morals. And you don't want to get those things all tied up. Again, I personally don't want my kids eating chocolate cake every day, but it says against the food police, so you don't want to police your kids. I think you can have a nice balance here. So kids can sense your stress too. Oh man, they are really like sponges. Everything you do, everything you say. So just kind of take again the breather in between reacting. And then as we were talking about earlier with the sport, so it says here, and I even looked up to make sure that there was a source before saying this. It was from nationaleatingdisorder.org. It's estimated that disordered eating affects 62% of females and 33% of male athletes. And then I'm not saying don't let your kid be an athlete because that's a risk factor. I'm just saying that if they are an athlete, you need to take a really close look, especially because the coaches are always like, which one of you guys was saying about being thinner, you'd go faster?
Yeah, I think especially with like track, I don't know. Like
Yeah.
distance girls and track especially, I don't know. I feel like they just associate like being slimmer with faster times. Yeah.
Yeah, so I run marathons and I can say that's probably true. Yeah, I would say that no, my weight has fluctuated because just in the past 4 years I've been pregnant twice. And I will say that when I'm thinner, I definitely go faster. But the coach is telling the high school students, like the thinner ones, you are gonna like get better scores. Like that's gonna be a lot of pressure. And so 41% of the female high school athletes reported disordered eating, and they were 8 times more likely to experience injury. So whenever you have an athlete, the statistical likelihood of them having an eating disorder is higher. And when you have an eating disorder, you actually get injured more easily. And so if you're doing a sport, it just all wraps up, and it's really not a good mixture of different things to have at the same time. You don't want your sports injuries. Let's see. College athletes at risk for developing anorexia nervosa was 25% for females, 10% for males, and bulimia was 58% for females and 38% for males. So again, don't not have your kid in physical activity just because you're afraid that the coach will be like, you need to lose weight, and then they'll have an eating disorder, but just be more mindful. And then it was recommended that kids are active for 60 minutes per day, but then it goes on to say that it was really 20 minutes, but they said 60 because if they overestimate, people are more likely to achieve that. I can see what's going on there with that. And then it also points out that not every child has the same benefit with exercise. I mean, some kids can just run around a little bit and they're thin as a rail, and some other kids may be heavier and are doing some kind of sports like 6 days a week. So it's pretty obvious, but it needs to be said that some kids are just not going to have the same effect doing a sport as another kid will. And don't sign your kids up for sports just because you want them to lose weight. I mean, make sure it's something that it's fun and they actually enjoy and they're having a good time, because maybe they're overeating because they're so miserable, and then you sign them up for a sport that they hate and they're even more miserable, and then they're going to go overeat. So do something your kid actually genuinely wants to do. Now, things like secret exercising, just like I said, secret eating, eating in secret or throwing away food secretly, anything done in secret, that's a red flag. So secret exercising, if like your teenager is exercising a lot and you're like, okay, we can't exercise today because we have to go to Aunt Sally's house, and then they start freaking out, and then we're at Aunt Sally's and you catch them like doing sit-ups and jumping jacks, then it might be like they have this compulsion to over-exercise, which is potentially indicative of an eating disorder. So those are some things to watch out for. So I said before that weight loss isn't ever indicated for a growing child. And so if the kid is on the top of the weight and the pediatrician's like, yo, you need to like lose weight, what actually should be done is that they could possibly stay at the same weight but then get taller, but you don't want the weight to drop. I suppose if they're morbidly obese, like I said, it's not the case if there's like some sort of hormonal chromosomal abnormality, or like I said, food insecurity, or they don't have access to food. That's a completely different thing. All right, so let's see, we're getting towards the end here. I just wanted to, atypical anorexia is the one I was talking about before. It's actually more prevalent than the regular anorexia that you've heard of. And this is the one that I was saying, it's just as dangerous as the anorexia that we all know about, like being too thin. So let's see. And this also has to do with somebody who is like a normal weight but is still severely restricting their intake, and that's atypical anorexia. Because believe it or not, like there are people who barely eat anything and then can have like a normal body weight. It's not like everybody who just quits eating very much at all just becomes super skinny. That's sometimes people are just set to be like very, very obese and then they stop eating and they're like a normal weight. So just keep in mind that, again, people with eating disorders aren't necessarily to look at them. You might not be able to tell just by looking at them. And then again, I might say this for the 8th time, American Academy of Pediatrics recommends dieting in kids. It's just not good. Oh, ARFID is the ARFID. That's what I was talking about. That's like extreme pickiness, but it's to the point where it's like really bad. It's called avoidant restricted food intake disorder. And so you don't want to just like if food insecurity and hormonal issues, like if things like this are going on, again, everything I say on these recordings is not obviously applicable to everybody or medical advice. So these are just things to keep in mind. If this is what's going on, you might not want to listen to anything that I'm saying right now, because you would need your own specific plan. And these kids, like the textures or the smell, like certain things about the food, they just start throwing up, and it can really lead to a lot of problems. And it's not like, you know, the child's fault or anything. So you definitely want to consult with a specialist if they have that avoidant restrictive eating. All right, so don't point out your kids' weight as problematic. So it's hard when I take my kids, they're like, oh, you don't weigh enough. And I'm like, shh, you know. Again, another one is autism spectrum disorder and eating disorders together. Again, it's like that needs special consideration. So the advice here is not necessarily applicable if that is what's happening. Another one would be if they have allergies like me, food intolerance, irritable bowel, diabetes, those sorts of things. Those you got to take separately and have your own specialist give you information about what to do in those cases. You know, you don't want your diabetic child to get an eating disorder either, but you might not necessarily be able to use a lot of the techniques I've been describing so far in a child with diabetes. So we talked about being a little kid, the challenges of that. I won't go into breastfeeding because I have like 10 other videos about breastfeeding, but let's just say there is a great deal about breastfeeding in this book too. All right, I think my camera turned sideways, but I fixed it. Oh, here's a great one. My toddler. So you gotta teach boundaries, and you gotta have solid boundaries. One is like if my kid is whining and they want something, I don't give it to them because it just teaches them to keep whining, because then they whine and they get what they want, even if they're whining for food. Because the book says if the kid wants food, you should give it to them because that's intuitive eating. They know when they're hungry, but I also don't want to reinforce whining. There's really a lot of psychology, and I understand that it could be just so confusing piecing through all these different things. But if your kid is whining for a food, You don't want to give into the whining because you don't want to teach them and reinforce whining and teaching them that whining gets what they want. But you also don't want to say no to the food because you want to establish intuitive eating. So what do? You say, I'm not giving you this food because you are whining, not I'm not giving you this food because this food is bad for you or something. Another one is my toddler throws everything on the floor. And so you say, when it drops on the floor again, we'll leave it there and let them observe the boundaries by not picking the food back up. The child will learn nothing if you say, if you throw that on the floor again, I'm leaving it there, and then they throw it and then you pick it up. Your kid just learns that you're full of it and they're not going to listen to you. And so they basically do that because they like to see your frustration. They think it's entertaining. So if you don't give in, like a bully, like a lot of times people bully you because they like to see you feel uncomfortable and like cry. And so when you get bullied, don't give them the satisfaction, just be like, and then walk away. So when your kid is messing with you to get attention, throwing food on the floor, you just ignore it and let it sit on the floor. Tough love. It's not that tough. I end up cleaning it up at some point. All right, guilt and shame. Don't guilt your kid. So you know how I was going on a lot about like when you feed your kids, you gotta let them decide and have their autonomy. Did any of you guys remember from your psychology classes, Erik Erikson's stages? Come on, Erik Erikson's stages, people. These are classics. All right. Nobody Erik Erikson? No Erik Erikson fans here? Okay. In this time period that I'm talking about, it's autonomy versus shame. And so you basically, autonomy is like a big thing during these early years. So that's why it's like really important to let them choose how much and what to eat. It helps them develop their sense of autonomy. So you guys should look up Erik Erikson. You'll learn something there. All right, you need to be consistent. Consistency is key in most aspects of parenting. So like I said, we do breakfast and the dinner at the same time every day, but also to be flexible. So if they want a snack or something, you can say, all right, have something here. Don't use labels. Like I said, we don't say fat or thin or calorie. And you know, sometimes I do like intermittent fasting, although if I was an intuitive eater, I wouldn't do that. But I guess the ship has sailed for me, but I want my kids to be intuitive eaters. So I've actually tried more to make sure I'm eating when they're eating too, and like share my food with them and things like that. I don't want to have them see me skipping meals because then they're going to think like, oh, skipping meals, mommy does that. Let's do that. And then no, I just don't want that. All right. And so no pressure. If you want your kid to eat something, place some of it on their plate, but don't be like, you gotta eat this. And then, like I said, engage them in cooking and then even gardening. And it's really rewarding to plant something. And when you're a little kid and watch it get bigger and bigger, and then you pick it and then you eat it yourself, like kids really get a kick out of that. So engage them in that. All right. And then you gotta know that the stuff that they teach at school, I don't even know if it's rooted in any kind of science. As a physician, I already have my Netter's anatomy and my Gray's anatomy, and my kids look through it. You got to talk to your kids about puberty and bodies because you can't rely on the school system to do it because honestly, who even knows what they're saying? So you want to be the one that explains this to the kids because they're just gonna, like, I don't know. When I grew up, we did have the internet, so but it was fresh and new. But now every kid has access to the internet. You don't want them learning about puberty through the internet. You want to talk to them about that. And so, Heavens, social media. We were talking about that earlier. How it is a huge risk factor. 2 to 2.6 times the risk of developing eating disorders. In this study, where there were kids that had very few little interactions with social media, and kids with a lot, of course, way more likely to have eating disorders because like I was saying earlier, now everything's AI generated and it's like, you're like, oh, now I have to look like this AI person. It's like, a lot of pressure. Guys, suicide is the second leading cause amongst kids 10 to 24 years old. Big deal. And whenever you have an eating disorder, you're at greater risk for suicide. So it's just like really important to take these precautions early and prevent eating disorders and potentially suicide later on. It is time consuming. I mean, I do have to write down like, hi, your legs, good jumping legs. And like, and there is no perfect parent, but you just do as much as you remember to do. And any little bit helps. Every little bit helps. All right. And so, oh, this is interesting. So there's a thing called Red S, and it's relative energy deficiency in sport. And it's whenever an athlete isn't eating enough to match the demands for like whatever endurance sport or whatever sport they're in. So that's something to pay attention to, because I'm sure a lot of you guys are in sports. You got to make sure that you get nutrients. And just because someone is still getting their period doesn't mean that they are eating enough. So like I said earlier, if you stop eating and you're not getting enough nutrients, your period's going to stop. But even if you have a period, that might not necessarily mean you're getting enough nutrients. And so sadly, if you do have an eating disorder, like I said, greater risk for suicide, greater risk for injuries during athletics or even any run-of-the-mill activity, and unfortunately, a greater risk of cardiac arrest. So not having an eating disorder is a really good thing. It protects you against all these like really bad stuff. So this goes on to say that typical medical training is weight-centered and fat-phobic. And I would actually have to agree, because as a physician, it's ingrained in me that like losing weight, anybody that comes into my office is overweight, it's going to be good for them to lose weight. And that's just how I think as a physician. And then as a physician, I'm always taking people's weights. But then from like a psychology perspective, a mental health provider, it's just like, I don't want to opine about people's weights when they're here. Like, that's just not good for your mental health. And in fact, my scale at the clinic is in kilograms, and people really appreciate it because a lot of people don't know how to convert kilograms, so they don't have to know how much they weigh when they come in. And I've even had people give me reviews online like, Dr. Waggle doesn't put the weight in pounds, so I never have to worry about knowing how much I weigh. I mean, it really does bother people to know their weight. And so yeah, just put it in kilograms. That way I get my doctor stuff done, but then my mental health provider stuff, I can still do that too. All right, so 77% of people interpret the growth charts incorrectly. When you guys either have your peds rotation or you have kids, it's like all about the growth charts, and people like obsess over them. But if 77% of people aren't able to read them correctly, you're basically, people are obsessing over things that they don't understand. So let's not go so obsessed with the growth charts. And this is me. I'm gonna have to take my kids in soon, and they're gonna be like, "Oh, I need to eat more," and I'm like, I need to make them intuitive eaters so that they don't have eating disorders. It's such a balance. But you know, you could try things like we have Pediasure, the 1.5, so that has like extra calories and things like that. Rules and over control backfire. So when, like, let's say if my kids were at the top and they were like overweight, and then I was trying to restrict their eating, and I was like, no, you can't, you can only eat this much, and then that would probably backfire and they would sneak food or what have you there. So being too controlling, it's like has the opposite effect. You have to be very careful. All right, so enough. So this is for people with financial insecurity. So enough food is the first goal, and then healthy food is the second goal. And I just want to point out some foods that are healthy and low cost: eggs, peas, beans, lentils, oatmeal, and cereals. So like I said, a lot of what I'm talking about here isn't applicable to people who like can't afford food. Like their number one goal is just to get their kids fed, right? And then another thing is this, what I'm about to say reminded me of breastfeeding. So a lot of lactation consultants will actually say it's okay to drink alcohol and breastfeed. Not that it is, but the reason they say that is because if the options are the mom drinks alcohol and doesn't breastfeed because she was told it's bad to drink alcohol and breastfeed, or breastfeeding and drinking alcohol, the lactation consultant would prefer that they breastfeed and drink alcohol. Not like get like trashed or something, but like, you know, just a little bit, because the benefits of breastfeeding, and I'm not, again, I promise I'm not going to go into breastfeeding, but the benefits of breastfeeding are so good that they don't want people to be deterred. So this is a similar concept when it comes to money in organic food. So if it's between, you can't afford organic food, organic vegetables, and you're like, or fruit, and you're like, well, I can't afford the organic fruit, so I'm just not going to feed my kid any fruit at all. You want to go with just fruit, even if it is not organic. So put another way, if you can't afford organic, it's far better to consume conventionally grown fruit and vegetables for the nutritional benefit than avoid them altogether. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I mean, ideally, don't drink and breastfeed, and ideally get organic fruits and vegetables. But if the alternative is not breastfeeding and not doing vegetables altogether, not organic and alcohol, if you have any problem with this concept, you can rewind and listen to it. But basically, don't just give up on fruits and vegetables because you can't afford the organic ones. Like I said, medical research, man, it really doesn't like look into people of color, or it's just it's marginalized, like marginalized groups. It doesn't take into consideration their specific needs, and a lot of research doesn't even like look into like women's needs. It's just, and it fails people of higher weight. So of course I love the medical field, but there are just some sorts of things. Obesity research, we could do a little bit more, I think. But of course, as a medical doctor, I would say that it's not very healthy to be obese, but as a mental health professional, it's not very healthy to obsess about your weight. Right, and then going into college, 30 to 40% of college students binge drink, and there's such a thing as FAD, which is food and alcohol disturbance, which comes increased risk, alcohol-related consequences, and people getting drunk and getting hurt and having accidents and doing things that aren't good. And then, you know, you go to college and then you don't have your parents there to tell you what to eat, and you don't know how to make food because your parents didn't teach you how to make food and grow your own food when you're young, and you're just eating takeout every night and getting drunk. It just, that's not like a good way to live, but unfortunately that's like what a lot of college students do. So then that is predisposed for eating disorders. And then another thing that you can do as a parent is to have, now I have a different book, and I won't say the name of it because there's a curse word in it, but it's basically how to raise kids that aren't use your imagination, and it's how to raise kids that are like not racist and not sexist and aren't sexual offenders, like I talked to at the beginning, like how society and parenting can raise boys to grow up to not take advantage of women and things like that. So I'm really big into raising my kids to not be a ... exclamation mark. And so one of the things that you can do, and that you shouldn't try to go and do this on purpose, this should just be like how life is, but to have a variety of friends and people that you hang out with. Like if you're only hanging out with super skinny people, your kids are going to notice that. So your kids observe your relationships with other people, and like if you're like, oh, I don't want to hang out with this person because they're fat or whatever, your kids are going to pick up on that. And so to be accepting of people of all colors and religions and sizes, and just hang out with people because you like their personality, and your kids will pick up if you're like not hanging out with certain people because of something you're discriminating against. So you want to reflect on everything you say, everything you do. Your kid is a sponge and they'll pick it up. And if you don't want them to have an eating disorder, don't make comments in front of them like they need to lose weight, or they've had too many calories, or your cellulite bothers you, or things like that. So what do you guys think? Are you excited to have kids? Comments?
Nowadays, now after listening to this, it feels like there's a lot more like things I need to keep in mind.
Well, the one thing that you can keep in mind is that there's no perfect parent. But you guys still have to go to medical school. You got tons and tons of years ahead of you. This will be more applicable on your peds rotation because you're going to be reading growth chart after height chart after head circumference chart, and you're going to be like, oh, I know about these, but I'm not going to obsess over them because I don't want to trigger an eating disorder. So any other comments or questions, you guys?
No, not really.
Ruhi, right?
Mhm.
Were you able to get a study? If not, I'll extend the deadline.
I wasn't
I
able
guess
to
it
get
was
a study.
optional, but
Mhm.
I won't. But it would be another hour in your hour long. But yeah, it's good to have not just like one book, because there's like a million references in the books, but like to have all sorts of other ideas. Like it makes a lot of sense that whenever you're isolated because of COVID, you're not going to be hanging out with a bunch of people that are like I don't know if you guys have seen Mean Girls, but they're all standing in the mirror like my pores are big and my cuticles and all that stuff. So if you're not hanging out with people and like they're judging you, that would be a protective factor. But then the social media, that is another factor. So other things that we could implement into our advice for raising kids without eating disorders, that would be good. But what do you think? What do you think is going to be an important takeaway to the prevention of eating disorders?
I feel like in general with eating disorders, I feel like the best thing is to stop comparison. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
in order to just I feel like comparison, what is it? Comparison is a thief of joy. I feel like comparing weight or like appearance to anyone in sports or just like in daily life just like doesn't do you any good. I feel like looking at it from a nutritional value, it's not good to compare like your caloric intake versus someone else's or like compare how you look to someone else's because like not everyone is essentially the same in how they function.
Exactly.
Yeah, kind of similar to that. I feel like there's a stigma or like not even a stigma, but there's like an association like people will be like, "Oh my God, you look so good. You look so skinny." Like people
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
when they compliment like Dr. Waggle touched on it how like you shouldn't like compliment your child's like appearance because that isn't necessarily something that they can like change and how you should like also value who they are. So I feel like that definitely ties into it.
Mhm.
Just like not
Right.
associating skinny with healthy.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And sometimes, and I remember this haunting thing that happened. I was like in third grade, and I was trying to give one of my friends a compliment, and I said like something about her being skinny because I thought like that's a compliment. But then I actually made her cry, and I felt really bad because people in society do equate skinny with compliment, but not everybody wants to be skinny, and skinny isn't always healthy, and skinny and positive should not be like synonymous with each other. So that's a great point. Aditi, are you there?
No, she had to leave early.
Oh, that's too bad. She missed the grand finale. Well, thank you guys very much. We'll be having another meeting soon. Make sure to sign into your Google Classrooms and complete your assignments. And that will be all for this evening. Yay. I
Mhm.
appreciate you guys. I hope you learned something.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Have a nice
Take
day.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.